Hello everyone, welcome back to The Bunker. Today, I'd like to tell you how I felt about A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood, the new movie about Fred Rogers and a journalist who, back in 1998, this is of course based on a true story, interviewed Fred Rogers and had kind of a life-changing experience over it. He was kind of a cynical person, he thought of himself as a broken person, and he begrudgingly was given an assignment to interview Fred Rogers and didn't want to, thought that he had to have been some kind of a fraud, that there's no way that he was as squeaky clean as he seemed to be on television, that there's no way that he was the same person in front of the camera as off camera. And he came to find that, like so many people did, that that was absolutely true, and that Mr. Rogers walked the walk and talked the talk, and that he, even though it was difficult for him at times, because he was a complex human being, just like all of us, he really did spend his life unselfishly, thinking about other people, giving himself for other people, and not living the life of a celebrity, and devoting himself to children, and specifically to teaching children how to manage their emotions, how to control themselves, to feel whatever they were feeling, and that those feelings were valid, but to also know how to respond to other people, and how to deal with those emotions in a positive way, and also, as he said in every episode, to understand that people could accept them just for who they are. And this is a movie that I was really looking forward to, and I had my reservations about it because I wasn't totally sure about Tom Hanks after seeing the trailers. I thought the movie looked fantastic, except I just didn't know that I wasn't going to be taken out the whole movie by Tom Hanks' performance, because it is Tom Hanks, and, you know, I'm familiar with his mannerisms, but I'm more familiar with Fred Rogers' mannerisms, and I didn't know if I would come to really buy him in the role, and I'll talk more about that later because I think that works to varying degrees in the movie, but I expected to like this movie. I didn't expect to be as surprised by this movie as I was. I thought I knew what I was getting myself into. I had a very clear sense of what this was likely to be. I figured it would be something of a fluff piece. I figured that it would be kind of, you know, plug in for the biopic formula, and it kept me guessing. It is not exactly what I expected it to be. And I had this really interesting experience with this movie, and I don't know that I've ever had this before, where for the first 20 minutes to half an hour, I wasn't sure about it. I didn't know if the people making this movie understood Fred Rogers and his philosophy. Fred Rogers, by the way, is a personal hero of mine. I've spent a lot of time studying the man, not just going back and watching Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, which I grew up with, but was not a big thing for me or anything. Fred Rogers, for me, is not about nostalgia. I came to appreciate the man's philosophy and his kind of countercultural outlook more later in life, as an adult. And a few minutes into this movie, it seemed like a really cynical piece, and like the people making this were so afraid to deliver Mr. Rogers to an adult audience that they had to find some way to kind of grit it up and make it weird and to be kind of almost creepy with it. And then that ends up being one of the best things about the movie, which is really impressive, and I couldn't believe the way it stuck the landing. I don't want to say too much about the framing device. I have issues with the framing device. I'm very confused about it. If I have to do best thing, worst thing, and I'm so conflicted about it, my worst thing with this movie probably is the framing device, just because, like, I love it, but I don't. Just because with the internal logic of the movie, I don't understand what exactly is going on there. It's one of those things where it can't possibly actually be happening and is kind of just for the audience's benefit, but thematically and as part of the artistic piece, it's also kind of genius, so I want to give it a pass on that, but it also breaks my brain because I have no idea what's going on with it. Basically, you're seeing an episode of Mr. Rogers that didn't and couldn't have existed, and the movie is bookended with it, and we also occasionally go back to it, but not very often, so it's kind of weird that we go back to it at all, because it basically just serves as a bookended framing device, and it's It's a way to bring in a cynical adult audience that lives in 2019 that doesn't believe probably that a man like this could have actually existed, and that people could be as kind-hearted and unselfish as Mr. Rogers was. And then the film itself is transformed from this kind of cynical piece at the same time as Lloyd is transformed by Mr. Rogers. And it has such a great sense of POV, especially because that doesn't begin with with Lloyd's POV, but it works really well, where throughout the movie, we're seeing everything from the lens of this guy who sees himself as broken. He says that he's broken. This is the trailer where he tells Mr. Rogers, Fred Rogers, that he's broken, and he says, "I don't see you as a broken person." And then the way he handles that is, by the way, the best scene in the whole movie, and I'll probably mention that again here in a minute, but he's going through the difficulties with his father, who ran off when he was a kid, and he never forgave him for it, and he's held all this anger for what his father did to him and his mother through his whole life. And in just talking with Mr. Rogers, which again is an assignment that is dropped on him from Esquire magazine, and he doesn't want to do it, and he keeps pushing against Mr. Rogers the whole movie, but all Fred wants to do is help this guy in the same way he wants to help everybody, to learn to manage his emotions and to learn to accept himself and to forgive people. And it does start off kind of creepy, because the movie doesn't just have Lloyd's perspective, but it has like a real-life perspective. This is a movie not for children. I think ultimately it's kind of a family film, but it doesn't feel like it until 20 or 30 minutes in. It's a brilliant risk that the movie takes, and I would encourage anybody to see this movie, even if you don't know anything about Fred Rogers, or you don't like Fred Rogers, or you also think he was too squeaky clean. I think the movie could change your mind on that a little bit, or at least change your mind on the character as presented in this fictitious film. And in saying that, I should also mention that I think the movie does completely understand Fred Rogers. I think whatever reservations I might have about bits of Tom Hanks' performance, the movie is absolutely presenting Fred Rogers as Fred Rogers. His Fred Rogers is always like the real one, doing the right thing, but you get a sense behind his eyes of his vulnerabilities and some of his frustrations and just how difficult this is. It's very much like a Superman or a Captain America, where he is a character who refuses to change, but it's not easy for him. And just like in real life, this Fred Rogers dodges certain personal questions that Lloyd gives him with interviews. Sometimes that's where some of the levity of the movie comes from. It's sometimes amusing the way in which he dodges questions, where he'll kind of use the excuse of being selfless and not wanting to talk about himself, but it actually comes from a place of vulnerability, where he doesn't want to discuss his own personal issues and idiosyncrasies any more than Lloyd does, and he turns things around on Lloyd to make him talk about his own problems. Yes, because he wants to help Lloyd, but also because he doesn't want to talk about himself. But he also will sometimes give Lloyd what he's looking for, and they certainly become friends. And Mr. Rogers is friends with everybody, but like they become actual friends, where he does start to open up to him a little bit, and particularly about his children and about how difficult it must have been for Fred Rogers' kids to grow up with Mr. Rogers as their father. That's a wonderful moment of vulnerability. Lloyd is the protagonist of this piece. Fred Rogers is not, and yet we get a really good character study of Fred Rogers through him, because what he's working on is an expose. Initially, it's not supposed to be. It's just supposed to be like a 400-character fluff piece, but it turns into this massive expose because he comes to really be interested in Fred Rogers as a character study because of the way he's affecting him personally. And again, he resists him really hard, and eventually Mr. Rogers ends up becoming the only person that he can go to in order to cope with what's happening with his father. And it's a wonderfully touching piece that goes without saying. But again, a surprisingly touching piece because I didn't know where it was going at the beginning and I didn't trust it. And I was like, okay, these people are making this really cynical Mr. Rogers movie because they want to appeal to adults in the audience and they don't want to make a kids movie. And it ends up being about how adults don't see Mr. Rogers the way children do. And it's a movie for adults, and it's a really sober film. It's not real mainstream. It's very art housey, not in a pretentious way, but it's just telling a story, and it's not a super commercial thing. I think the most commercial thing about this movie is the title, and maybe the fact that it goes for kind of cutesy transitions with model work, which it won me over on. At first, I thought it was too cutesy, and ultimately, it won me over on it. I think mostly because it didn't shy away from using the models in the more kind of depressing parts, which gave it this weird kind of levity, but also added to its really interesting perspective on the whole thing, where it feels like it's maybe somewhat for adults that didn't even know Mr. Rogers, but it's also for adults that remember growing up with that show, but are now looking at it through a different lens. And so, again, I'm surprised by all the things that it won me over on. I didn't like how cynical it felt at the beginning, and then it wins me over on starting from that place. It wins me over on that weird framing device. The movie not only gets Mr. Rogers, but it gets everybody else too. And it gets why people don't buy that he was the way he actually seems to have been. And makes the ending feel so much less sappy. I think starting from what looks like a more cynical place is what actually makes the feel-good nature of it by the end really work and come together. But I mentioned that the title is one of the most commercial, is really the most commercial thing about it. A Beautiful Day in the Neighborhood doesn't really mean anything. It's kind of just, you know, a phrase that's associated with Mr. Rogers and might sell movie tickets, so that's what we call the film. It's an okay title. It just doesn't have a lot to do with what's happening in the movie. It's not like all this takes place in a day. It's not like it's really about a neighborhood so much as just you know, Pittsburgh, where Fred Rogers works, and this guy keeps flying back and forth. Like, the title doesn't really have a lot to do with this movie. So, like I said, that's what makes it the most commercial thing. But beyond that, it's just a movie. It's just telling a story. Let me talk a little bit about Tom Hanks' performance. Like I said, had a little bit of a reservation about it from the trailers. A lot of people said that he was just doing his Forrest Gump accent, and it's weird because the way the trailer is put together, it kind of sounds like that, but I didn't really get that vibe from it with the movie at all. I think the trailer, by the way, sold this movie the way it needed to be sold in order to get people to go see it, and then again, it's not the movie exactly that's being sold to you. I mean, maybe it sort of is by the end, but it's so much more thoughtful than the kind of, you know, paint by numbers fluff piece that it looked like it might have been. But yeah, I think Tom Hanks gives a brilliant performance, and he still doesn't fully feel like Mr. Rogers to me until about halfway through the movie. There is a scene where he completely wins me over from then on to the end of the film. And I wonder how much of this was shot in sequence, because I feel like he's struggling a little bit at the beginning and then has almost completely nailed it by the end. It does have that problem somewhat even throughout, of just, these are both two personalities that I know pretty well merged together, and it's never quite that Jim Carrey thing, and I've never seen anybody else quite pull off what Jim Carrey did with Man on the Moon with Andy Kaufman, where I completely forget that I'm looking at Jim Carrey. Tom Hanks never quite manages that, but for the first half of the movie, I didn't even really feel like I was looking at Fred Rogers. Like, I felt like the movie was getting who Fred Rogers was, and Tom Hanks was doing the best he could, but it always felt like Tom Hanks doing an impression. And then there's the scene in the coffee shop where everything stops, and we get silence. And Fred Rogers was all about silence. and it is one of the most powerful moments in a movie theater I have ever had. And I can't tell you how hard it hit me, how much it affected me. I'm like call me sentimental and emotional, but like I'm almost tearing up just thinking about it again. It got me so hard, and I don't want to say too much else about it. It's the most powerful moment of silence I've ever seen in anything, and I love how this movie appreciates that about Fred Rogers too. How important silence is, and slowing things down. The movie, the pacing of the movie is great because it's more fast-paced toward the beginning. Outside of that framing device, from Lloyd's perspective, and it slows down as the movie progresses, as he's starting to appreciate what Fred Rogers is about, and as Rogers is rubbing off on him. And from that moment on, Tom Hanks was Fred Rogers to me. Uncannily, there were all of these places where suddenly he seemed to get the nuances of the man better. And at the end of the film, he does the closing song from Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood, and everything he does with his face is perfect, and it gave me chills. It was just wonderful. So ultimately, I think Tom Hanks' performance in this is spectacular, and if he got nominated for an Oscar for it, I think he would be absolutely deserving of that. I don't think anybody could fully 100% pull off Mr. Rogers, and I'm not sure that I wouldn't have gone with a no-namer just so that I'm not thinking about another actor, and that's taking me out as I'm watching it. But I also don't know if you would find anybody to Tom Hanks' caliber. This is going to sound bizarre to people. I've wanted to mention this somewhere on the channel. This is the best place to talk about it. The person I might have cast, and it might be difficult to make him look like him, and people are so used to this actor playing creepy characters that it might take them out too much, and they might never buy it because of that. But there's an episode of Babylon 5, of all things, with Brad Dourif, where he's playing a character who used to be a psychopathic killer, but his mind has been wiped, and now that's the thing they do in the criminal justice system, and now he's working for the Catholic Church, and he's a really good person, and everything he's doing is like Fred Rogers in that episode. And I was like, Brad Dourif could have played Fred Rogers, which sounds like the most bizarre casting choice, but I wish I could have seen that. I wish I could have seen Brad Dourif try to pull off Fred Rogers. But Tom Hanks does an amazing job with this. It turns out, by the way, that apparently Tom Hanks and Mr. Rogers are like sixth cousins, like they're really distantly related, which is really interesting, and not why he was cast, but I just found that out recently. Apparently Tom Hanks didn't really grow up with Mr. Rogers, was not really familiar with the man, but did his research, obviously, and fully understands and appreciates what Fred Rogers was all about. I don't do the bored anymore on this show. This movie made me feel bored anymore, but if I did, it would be this movie made me feel like trying harder, which is what you want from a Fred Rogers movie. The idea that I think this movie is trying most to get across, and it's about a lot of things, is that anybody could be Fred Rogers. That he is just a guy. He's just a person like everybody else, but he tries harder than most of the rest of us to be selfless, to be decent, and he understands how to feel his emotions, but not take everything out on other people, and how to think about other people first. And I don't know how anybody could see this and not want to be more like that. Like I said, it starts from this kind of, maybe this guy is really creepy and weird place, and then the movie tries to make the audience understand him as Lloyd does, and I would be very surprised if that didn't work on most people. I can't say enough good things about this movie. Obviously, I'm feeling it. I loved this a lot, and I'm biased because, again, this is a person, this is a character that I admire and that I care a lot about, and I wanted this to be great and moving, and I wanted to cry in the movie theater, and I did. So I mean, I walked in hoping those things would happen, but I also think that I'm more critical of it than some other people might be because I've spent so much time studying the man and his philosophy, and it absolutely worked. There is the soundtrack in this is extraordinary. I was really impressed with how much of Fred Rogers' repertoire managed to make it into this movie. A lot of the songs from that show that you would recognize, a couple kind of deep pulls even, and stuff kind of winding its way in and out of the orchestral soundtrack. It's a really nice understated score. I kind of want to go on Spotify and just listen to it. I think it's probably a real listenable score outside of itself. But man, this movie is moving, and it's a really good, like, textbook study of perspective, of how to make an audience feel like the protagonist, and how to change an audience as you're changing a protagonist, or at least giving the potential of doing that. And it's also a really good study in how to make unlikable characters sympathetic. I want to throw that out too. This is going to be weird for some people. I know some of you guys are going to think I'm very bizarre for doing this, but I really want to. So I hope you guys will indulge me. I want to do what Fred Rogers so often did, and this is in this movie as well. And this also closed out the documentary. I want to end this video with a few seconds of silence, because silence was so important to Fred Rogers, and it's become more important to me. And I'm a real fast-paced guy. I'm a real, like, get as much done during the day as possible. I'm real frantic. I think of myself as a somewhat uptight person, and Fred Rogers has taught me the importance of silence. And it's a thing that I don't incorporate in my life as much as I ought to, and I think this is a really good place to do this. So I hope you guys will permit me. Take a few seconds right now, the end of this video, to think about all of the people in your life who have made you who you are, who have brought you into being. Let's do that, shall we? And if you want to, feel free to put in the comments one of the people that you were thinking of. I thought of my parents, I thought of my wife, and I thought of one of my mentors in college, one of my writing mentors. Leave your comments, tell me if you saw this movie, what you think of it, and thanks for indulging me at the end there, and I will see you again for another one very shortly. I'm Captain Logan, thanks a lot for watching, guys.